Evening, everyone. Thought that I would quickly jump online and share with all of you some of the news that we shared this afternoon around the next steps in our alert level framework. So just before I launch in and to give everyone a bit of context from where I am now, which is clearly not the office, but instead the lounge at Premier House. I'm actually sitting in, technically, part of Neves Fort. All of the, as is the case with basically every house across New Zealand right now, I think our furniture is all being turned into basically Neves playthings. So I'm sitting on the back of the fort right now, but here to give you a quick rundown of the alert level update that we shared today. So many of you will remember that the very first moment that we moved into the alert level system, just grabbing my prop of what that looks like, many of you will remember this. And this was the way that we explained that we would make decisions depending on how bad COVID was in New Zealand at any given time and what our risks were around community transmission, what kind of restrictions we would then need to have. And so, of course, we're sitting at alert level 3 now, and that hasn't changed, by the way. But whenever we're preparing for the future, we always set out what the next level will look like in a little more detail. So that framework is already out there. But, of course, we set that framework, a month ago. So we always like to make sure that before we move down, or move to the next stage, that we share a little more detail. So just really the important top line messages are that basically people can reopen and return to work with only really a handful of things that aren't really able to operate as they usually would at level 2. So if you're a hairdresser, and I see a couple of people jumping up on there to say that that's the area that they work in. If you're a hairdresser and a beautician at level 2, you can reopen. But we do need to treat those professions just a little more differently than others. Of course, for the most part, we're still saying to people, try and keep your distance. When you're out and about and you're passing, say, strangers in the street, stick to keeping those couple of metres between you, because those are being designed in case someone is sick and isn't following the rules of staying home, that if you're in close proximity to them, then that's a problem, because if someone's unwell, it's much easier for them to spread it to you if they're close. So if you're with strangers, keep your distance. But if you're in your place of work, we can cope with less distance because we can contact trace. But for things like beauticians and hairdressers, really hard to keep social distance when you're cutting someone's hair or giving someone a facial. So for you, we're asking that you use PPE or personal protective equipment. And so that obviously raises the question for some, and I just saw a message go up asking, where will we get that PPE from? We, of course, do have manufacturers in New Zealand of, at least for instance, surgical face masks. And so I've asked our team, who have been helping provide all of the information on the COVID website, to make sure we put out information to those who will need to be able to access some of that kit to be able to help them find it and locate it. Because obviously not every retailer is stocking it, although I'm told today that the pharmacy locally here is again, so that suggests to me it should hopefully be back on people's shelves. So that's a really big shift when we do eventually get there. It means retail will be open, but they need to make sure that they are managing social distancing, and that, of course, they're keeping good hygiene practices on all common surfaces that are used and touched regularly. Lots of questions, of course, about how we would treat things like hospitality and cafes and restaurants. Well, for all of that sector, at level 2, the framework sets out that they can open, but there are certain principles that they need to apply. I call them the 3 S's because it's nice and easy to remember. Firstly, when you go to a restaurant, a bar, a cafe, everyone has to be seated. Basically, you can only let in as many customers as you have seats. Now, the reason for that is we still need to socially distance people. And if you have pubs and clubs where people are rammed in together, where they're all standing, where they're all intermingling, it becomes really hard to enforce social distancing. So that's the first, seated. The second is space. People need to be socially distanced. And so that's the second principle. And the third is you need to have a single server who's serving you at tables so that you're not going up to bars or counters and intermingling again with other people. That way we can keep a record of who's in the space as well and who may have been in close contact with. I just saw someone asking some questions about accessing things like heaters and blankets and things. Yes, that would, of course, that will all be accessible because retail will be. And Lara's asked, will things like personal counselling be okay? And the answer is yes. All of those services are able to reopen again, but we ask them to apply all of the public health measures that we've been putting out, keeping your distance, making sure people are frequently hand washing, and making sure that we continue to clean frequently used surfaces and so on. Of course, I've got the question here. Jennifer, you said you're a hairstylist. Are we needing our clients to wear their mask or just the hairstylist? The answer is, Jennifer, technically, either having all the clients or the hairdresser. But the decision we talked about was actually it's easier to communicate if we're actually having the hairdressers, because you've always got to make sure that they're applied correctly. And they do need to be, if they're a surgical mask, changed quite frequently. And so having one person getting used to using them and making sure that they're thinking about how they're using them is probably a bit easier than having all of clients do that. So ultimately, though, that's what we're asking. When it comes to your bubbles at level 2, when we get there, you are able to start seeing other people, friends and family, but remembering again that what we want to avoid are lots of close proximity, lots of physical contact still at this stage. So not having large events and things like that is still going to be key. So we're saying don't have big parties at home because we still need to make sure that people are keeping their distance. I saw someone just ask about coaching of sports. Yes, things like sports can resume. We're asking all the different codes to help work up just some guidance on how people can manage the resumption of sport, because yes, we'll have people in closer proximity playing sport, but actually we want to keep spectators spaced out and a lot of distance, and things like netball courts can be a bit congested. So we're just working through how those things will work. Someone's just asked a question about swimming pools and why they would be opened. I think because they raised the question about kids accessing swimming pools. Again, I think the really important point here is that we wouldn't move and we won't move to level 2 unless it is safe to do so. And we would only do that, of course, if we really have that sense that we have the virus under control. And so therefore, we'll only be sending children back into schools and so on if we believe it is safe to do so. And you will have seen that at the moment we have very low and sometimes no cases on a daily basis. And so we haven't made the decision yet, but we will only make that decision if we believe it's safe. And that includes for children, and that includes for workplaces, and that includes for public places like, for instance, things like pools. Marcel, I think it is. Again, none of those decisions have been made yet. They are still to come. So I hope that's covering off some of the questions that you have, but I see a lot that are individual about different workplaces. Basically, the really things are, again, as I say, able to open, but we just ask people to behave differently, to be vigilant, to play it safe and create a new normal where they're constantly building in hand hygiene and distancing and so on. The things where you won't see operating as per normal are, big conferences, big events, big mass gatherings that you might be used to. At level 2, there's still a cap on how many people can be together, and so that will be different. And also, I just saw someone who asked the question, what about physical contact when we see people? Again, we're asking people for that social distance, and so it will be some time before I think you'll see people freely hugging everyone they see or shaking hands with everyone they meet. Yes, you'll want to give your close family and friends who you haven't seen a bit of contact, but more broadly, just make sure that you're not going back to your workplace and hugging and shaking everyone's hands. It unfortunately undermines everything we're trying to do. Kylie, I see that you say that you're a lash artist. Yes, we count you amongst those who are in those services like beauty therapy, hairdressing and so on that will be able to open. But again, those who are in close proximity, who can't keep physical distance to their clients, who are really dealing right up and personal like a lash artist, we will be asking you to use personal protective equipment. We'll be putting some guidelines out about that just to support you in that as well. Victoria, you ask about people who are immune compromised, and again, that also comes to things like those who might be a bit older. And there, we're just saying, actually, again, when you go out, play it safe. So trying to make sure you keep that physical distancing and really look after yourselves as well. Someone just asked about malls and shopping centres. Yes, we're asking them to apply the same principles that you've seen supermarkets use. So making sure they don't have so many people in the venues that they can't keep space, and practicing all of the hygiene, cleaning those surfaces that are commonly used by people and so on, just in the same way you would have seen supermarkets doing that. Some people are asking questions. Ray, you've asked about the pay cut for ministers. We've already signalled that will be a 6-month period. We're having to draft, of course, the legislation to make it enforced, but it will be for 6 months. So whenever it comes into force, it will then run from there, regardless of when that law comes in. Sharon, you ask about church services and gatherings. They'll be capped at how large they can be. So it will depend on the size of the church. They can't be any larger than 100 and they need to have social distancing. So if it's a church that maximum can only ever usually hold 80, if everyone's crammed into a pew, they might have a smaller capacity because they do have to space people out. I see a couple of questions about tattoo studios. Yes, they also can reopen, but again, people who are in close proximity, just in the same way as I've said for beauty salons and hairdressers, tattoo parlours will need to use appropriate PPE, but actually, in many cases, you often already do, so that won't be new to you. Vicky, you ask about fishing on boats, recreation. Yes. That will be able to be used at level 2 as well. Someone asked whether or not, on behalf of their dog, whether they can run off a leash. Well, it depends on whether it's a dog park or not. So I hope that's answering some of your questions. I see a range that are about education. Look, we're really careful to put really specific guidance out on that. So do jump on the COVID-19 website or the Ministry of Education to see some of those updates. I do see a question about the borders, just to be really clear that those remain closed except to Kiwis coming back, and for the time being, they do still need to quarantine. Whilst the numbers coming in at the border are relatively low, we are still seeing COVID cases come in at the border. So it's been a really important part of our strategy to stamp out COVID, has been the management at the border. Sorry if I haven't managed to answer all your questions. Tim's asking me what I'm reading at the moment. Obviously, Harry McCleary's always on the list. I can tell you that actually what I'm reading at the moment is mostly contained in here. That's the trusty briefcase that follows me everywhere. So I'll be reading what's in there tonight. And on that note, I should probably get back to it. Thank you for joining me, everyone. I see still lots of questions, so feel free to jump on the COVID-19 website. My final reminder to everyone is we are not there yet. Stick with it, stick with the plan, and we very much hope that we will be in a position to move to alert level 2 if we continue on a really solid trajectory, as long as we continue to win this battle. But it is not over yet, so please stick with it, everyone. Everyone's doing incredibly well, but we just need to stick with the plan. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to the team of 5 million, and I'll talk to you again soon.